Picture the scene. The world is burning. Cities are being overrun by a biological tide of the infected. In the movies, this is the moment a black helicopter touches down. Men in hazmat suits jump out, stamped with the baby blue emblem of the United Nations, and order is restored. They have a plan. They have the guns. They have the cure. It is a comforting fiction. But if you actually read the Charter of the United Nations, or the operational protocols of the World Health Organization, a very different, much darker picture emerges. If a World War Z scenario happened tomorrow, a fast-spreading, aggression-based pathogen, the global institutions we pay to protect us wouldn't just struggle, they might be the first things to collapse. Today, we are running a simulation. We are taking the actual legal and logistical mandates of the UN and WHO and throwing them into the meat grinder of a zombie apocalypse to see if they survive. I'm Tong, and this is Survival Curriculum. We look at pop culture disasters through the lens of hard evidence and disaster management protocols. Today we are asking, could the global community actually coordinate a defence against the end of the world? Or is international cooperation just a fair weather friend? Before we crack open the classified binders, make sure you've secured your spot in the bunker by subscribing and hitting that notification bell. We release deep dives like this every week, and you don't want to be the one guy who missed the briefing on evacuation routes. Alright, let's look at the players. In the blue corner, we have the bureaucracy. In the red corner, we have the biting hordes. In Max Brooks' novel World War Z, and definitely in the Brad Pitt movie, the UN is depicted as a sort of super government in waiting. They act as the central nervous system for humanity's survival. They coordinate the destress, the deep staged resources. They organise the refugee flows. They are the ones writing the history books after the dust settles. It implies that when the chips are down, national borders dissolve and we all salute the globe flag. It's a beautiful idea. It suggests that there is a dormant global defence mode that can be activated with a special key. But here is the reality check. The UN is not a world government. It has no sovereignty, it has no territory, and, crucially, it has no army of its own. It is basically a very fancy, very stressed out secretary for 193 arguing bosses. Let's look at the actual mandate. The UN's power comes entirely from the political will of its member states. If the US, China, Russia, or any major player decides to lock their doors and ignore the phone, the UN is paralysed. In a zombie scenario, where the threat is existential and immediate, the instinct for every nation is going to be hypernationalism. Protect our own. The WHO is in a similar boat. They are the global health leader, yes, but they cannot force a country to share data. They cannot force a country to let inspectors in, and they certainly cannot force a country to distribute a vaccine to its neighbours before its own citizens. In the early days of a zombie outbreak, the UN wouldn't be commanding fleets. They would be stuck in emergency sessions, arguing over the wording of a resolution while the delegates outside are getting eaten. There is also the boring, gritty reality of cash. The UN and WHO operate on budgets that are constantly strained. Disaster relief funds are often voluntary contributions. In a World War Z scenario, the global economy vaporizes in about 72 hours. Stock markets crash, currencies become worthless, and electronic banking fails. Suddenly, the mechanism that funds the global response, wire transfers from sovereign treasuries, ceases to exist. How does the WHO pay for shipping jet fuel? How does the UN pay peacekeepers? You can't pay soldiers with a resolution. Without a functioning economy, the global coordinator is just a guy with a radio that nobody is answering. The fiction assumes the lights stay on at headquarters. The reality is that headquarters gets its power cut just like everyone else.
Let's give credit where it is due. If there is one thing the WHO is actually built for, it is the early warning system. They have the Global Outbreak Alert and Response Network, or GOARN. It's a web of institutions, labs, and health agencies that are constantly sniffing the air for bad bugs. In the World War Z book, the outbreak starts slow. Isolated cases. African rabies. In that specific scenario, the WHO would absolutely know something was wrong. They would likely detect the anomaly within days. We saw this with COVID, and we saw it with Ebola. The surveillance works. If a new virus pops up that turns people violent, the red phone rings in Geneva very quickly. They would deploy an epidemiological team to the site, take samples, and try to sequence the genome. The intelligence part of the war would start strong. But here is the World War Z problem. In the movie version, the transformation takes 12 seconds. In the book, it's slower, but the spread is exponential. The WHO's protocols are designed for biological speed, incubation periods of days or weeks. They rely on contact tracing. You ask the patient, "Who did you talk to yesterday?" But you can't contact trace a rage virus. You can't interview a patient who is trying to chew through the restraints. The standard playbook for containment relies on isolation and treatment. But if the treatment center becomes a slaughterhouse in 20 minutes, the data stops flowing. The WHO monitoring teams on the ground, they are the first casualties. We would go from "we have a signal" to "signal lost" before a report could even be typed up. The speed of a zombie pathogen outpaces the speed of bureaucratic observation.
Then comes the human element. The Great Panic in World War Z was exacerbated by denial. Real-world history supports this. When a terrifying new disease appears, the instinct of the local government is often to cover it up to prevent economic collapse or political unrest. We have seen this with SARS, with early COVID, even with historical flu pandemics. The WHO can shout emergency all they want, but if the host nation says it's just a riot or it's a chemical leak, the global response is delayed. In a zombie apocalypse, that delay is fatal. By the time the UN Security Council watches the satellite footage of a city burning, it's too late to close the airport. The virus is already in London, Tokyo, and New York. The system is designed to trust member states, and that trust is the fatal flaw. So, the virus is out. Phase 2. Containment. In the movies, you see this global map where borders turn red and snap shut in unison. The UN issues a global travel ban. But in reality, the UN cannot close a border. Only a country can do that. And history shows us that border closures are messy, porous, and usually too late. In a zombie scenario, you aren't just dealing with tourists at the airport. You are dealing with millions of terrified refugees fleeing the infection zones. Imagine the border between a safe country and an infected one. Now imagine 10 million people rushing that fence. There is no WHO guideline for that. That isn't a medical crisis anymore. It's a military invasion. This is where the united part of United Nations falls apart. In World War Z, nations like Israel initiate a self-quarantine early, the reverse Masada option. They wall themselves off. This is the most realistic outcome. The global response essentially fractures into 193 separate survival strategies. The WHO might be begging countries to accept refugees or send medical aid, but the political leadership in every capital will be staring at the math. If we let them in, we let the virus in. The international solidarity required to fight a global pandemic evaporates the moment the survival of the state is at risk. We would see a total collapse of international law. The UN Convention on Refugees? Ignored. The Declaration of Human Rights? Suspended. It becomes the law of the lifeboat.
And what about the countries that can't close their borders? The developing world, nations with weak infrastructure, or those in the middle of civil wars? The UN usually steps in here with aid convoys and peacekeepers. But who sends the aid? The donor nations are busy fighting zombies in their own suburbs. The supply chain for humanitarian aid, rice, water, medicine, relies on surplus. In an apocalypse, there is no surplus. The UN World Food Programme is a marvel of logistics, but they don't grow the food, they move it. If the grain silos in the Midwest are overrun, the aid ships don't sail. The sad truth is that the UN's ability to help the most vulnerable depends entirely on the stability of the most powerful. When the powerful fall, the vulnerable are left to the dark. Let's talk about guns, the military response. In the book, we see a multinational force trying to hold the line. People often think the UN has a standing army. They don't. The blue helmets are soldiers borrowed from other countries: Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Rwanda, India. They are deployed to keep peace between humans who have signed a treaty. They are not trained, equipped, or mandated to fight a total war against an enemy that doesn't surrender. UN peacekeepers operate under strict rules of engagement. They usually can only fire in self-defense. How do you write a rule of engagement for a zombie? Do not fire until the subject attempts to eat you? It's ludicrous. Furthermore, the command structure is a nightmare. A UN commander has to radio New York for permission to escalate. Against an enemy that moves at a sprint, that lag time is death. Here is the kill shot for UN military intervention: the asset recall. Let's say the US has 3 battalions deployed as UN peacekeepers in Africa. The moment New York City reports an outbreak, the President of the United States is recalling those troops. Every nation will pull its assets home to defend the capital. The UN peacekeeping force would dissolve overnight. The helicopters, the APCs, the medical units, they all have flags painted on the side, and those flags take precedence over the blue globe. We saw this in the book with the Battle of Yonkers. It was a US military failure, not a UN one. The realization is that when the war is total, there are no peacekeepers, because there is no peace to keep. There is only survival. There is one area where the UN Security Council matters: nuclear weapons. In a World War Z scenario, as conventional defences fail, the temptation to use tactical nukes to cauterize infected cities grows. We see this in the fiction, Russia or Pakistan considering the nuclear option. The UN's role here would be desperate diplomacy, trying to prevent panic launches, trying to stop a zombie apocalypse from turning into a radioactive apocalypse. This is actually where the UN might have the most impact. Not in fighting the zombies, but in keeping the remaining human powers from blowing each other up in the confusion. It's a grim mandate. Please die quietly without using the nukes. But it might be the only successful directive they issue. Let's pivot to the war for your mind. Information. The WHO and UN are actually very good at making posters, hand-washing graphics, social distancing guidelines. In the early phase, they would be the primary source of the truth. They would issue the technical guidance. Aim for the head. Bites are fatal. Water transmission is possible. The problem isn't the message, it's the medium. In the age of social media, a zombie outbreak would be the ultimate misinformation event. You would have influencers claiming the virus is a hoax, or that you can cure it with essential oils. You'd have conspiracy theories that the UN created the virus to establish a new world order. The WHO's calm, scientific voice would be drowned out by the scream of the internet. We actually have a word for this now,
coined by the WHO. Infodemic. In World War Z, Brooks wrote about Phalanx, a fake vaccine that gave people false hope and made them careless. That was fiction, but it was prophetic. In a real outbreak, the market for fake cures would explode. The UN would be fighting a two-front war, one against the virus and one against the grifters selling snake oil. And unlike a normal pandemic, where you have months to debunk myths, here you have hours. If someone believes a rumour that zombies can't swim and flees to a lake, they die. If they believe it's just the flu and don't barricade the door, they die. The UN's inability to enforce information control, to actually shut down the lies, would lead to millions of preventable deaths. Eventually, the internet goes dark, the servers go down, the power grid fails. Now the UN's fancy websites and Twitter feeds are useless. We are back to shortwave radio. This is ironically where the UN might shine again. They have legacy systems. They have satellite comms that don't rely on local power plants. In the deep apocalypse, the voice of the UN broadcasting on emergency frequencies might be the only thing connecting isolated survivors. It wouldn't be coordination anymore. It would just be proof of life. A loop recording saying, "This is Geneva. We are still here. Stay quiet. Stay hidden." That psychological value is real, even if it doesn't put food on the table. Everyone loves the search for the cure plotline. It's the third act of the movie. Brad Pitt flies around the world, finds the pathogen's weakness, and saves the day. Can the WHO actually do this? Theoretically, yes. They have the mechanism to pool global scientific data. They can coordinate the solidarity trials, testing potential treatments across dozens of countries simultaneously. If there is a biological weakness to the zombies, the WHO network is the best bet to find it. They can link a lab in Atlanta with a lab in Seoul and a supercomputer in Switzerland. This is their home turf. Virologists love collaboration. But science takes time, and time is the one resource the undead consume faster than brains. Let's say they find it, a vaccine, or a camouflage agent like in the movie. Now you have to manufacture 7 billion doses. In a world where the factories are burning, where the truck drivers are dead, where the glass vials are made in a country that no longer exists. This is the cold chain problem. Most vaccines need refrigeration. They need a continuous chain of temperature-controlled storage from the factory to your arm. If the power grid is down, the cold chain is broken. You could have the cure in a vat in Geneva, but if you can't fly it to Brazil, keep it cold, and find a nurse to inject it without getting bitten, it's worthless. The WHO can invent the recipe, but they cannot cook the meal for the whole planet without a functioning industrial base. The movie solution, injecting yourself with a deadly illness to become invisible to zombies, is actually the most UN solution possible. It's a compromise. It's not a cure. It's a mitigation strategy. It's messy, dangerous, and imperfect, but it works statistically. Real-world WHO strategy often looks like this. It's about harm reduction. If they can't stop the zombies, they might focus on distribution of blockers or masking agents. But again, this implies a remnant of order. If the labs are overrun, the science dies with the scientists. The reality is that the cure probably comes years later, developed by a small, fortified enclave, not a global committee. So, does the UN survive? In the book World War Z, the UN actually emerges as the governing body of the survivors. Why? Because when the nations are broken, the only thing left is the idea of unity. But the role shifts. They stop trying to command the war and start managing the peace. They become the administrators of the safe zones. They manage the rationing cards. They organise the work crews to clear the dead. This is plausible. The UN is great at refugee management. When the entire human race becomes refugees, the UNHCR, the refugee agency, becomes the most important government on Earth. They wouldn't be generals, they would be camp counselors for a traumatized species. Here is the final verdict. Could the UN and WHO coordinate a global response to a zombie outbreak? In the first 72 hours, yes. They would sound the alarm, name the threat, and try to organise the flight bans. But from hour 73 onwards, as the exponential growth hits the vertical, they would fail. The speed of the infection breaks the speed of diplomacy. The hard power of national militaries would take over, and international cooperation would vanish behind closed borders. The World War Z scenario of a unified global offensive is a fantasy until the stabilisation phase, years later, when the surviving powers need a neutral ground to meet. The UN doesn't save us from the apocalypse. The UN is what we rebuild after the apocalypse to remind us not to let it happen again. So, if you hear the air raid sirens and check your phone to see a WHO alert about violent behaviour in metropolitan areas, don't wait for the blue helmets to show up. They are stuck in a meeting. Grab your bug-out bag, follow your local evacuation plan, and remember that in the end, survival is local. I want to hear your take. In a real zombie event, which organisation falls first? The UN? The WHO? Or your local DMV? Leave your intel in the comments below. If you enjoyed this breakdown, destroy that like button like it's a shambler at the fence line. I'm Tom, this is Survival Curriculum, and until next time, keep your cardio up.